Good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sabrina Hartuno and I am one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows for this year. A recently declassified UN report showed that North Korea continued enhancing its nuclear and ballistic missile programs last year, which breached the UN sanctions. On the other side of the world, tensions between US and Iran have steadily risen after the former withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in May 2018. What happened to all the diplomatic talks that was supposed to prevent such a proliferation crisis from happening? Drawing on his experience as a diplomat at the negotiating table with parties from Pyongyang and Tehran, our speaker tonight hopes to shed some light on why past nuclear agreements have faltered and how to succeed in future ones. Richard Johnson, class of 2001, is a senior director for fuel cycle and verification at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI. Previously, he served as the acting deputy lead coordinator for Iran nuclear implementation at the US Department of State, having also served as assistant coordinator for Iran nuclear issues. Prior to working at the Department of State, Johnson was director for nonproliferation at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Johnson has been deeply involved in Iran and North Korea nuclear issues, including as a member of the U.S. delegation to the JCPOA Joint Commission and the six-party talks. On assignment to the Department of Energy/National Nuclear Security Administration, Johnson was a U.S. nuclear disablement monitor at Yongbyon nuclear facility in the DPRK. Johnson graduated as valedictorian from Claremont McKenna College and later earned his master's degree at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Johnson is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a Presidential Management Fellow, as well as a one-time Jeopardy champion. Mr. Johnson's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the President's Leadership Fund. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time and adjust your seats if you had not already done so. I must also remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Now, please join me in welcoming Richard Johnson to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure and a little bit of a trip to be here at the Athenaeum. As an alum and as a student, I've been telling people that this is literally peak CMC to come back and speak at the AT. So thank you very much, particularly to Professor Lisa Koch for helping to arrange this and helping me to come here, and to Priya and the entire AT staff. I'm also a little bit nervous to see at least one of my former professors in the audience, Professor Chae-Jin Lee, from whom I learned first about North Korea and Northeast Asia. So if I get anything wrong, just please put it, you can correct it in my transcript afterwards. And I also see Ward Elliott here, for whom I helped to prepare for my Latin oration at my graduation. So there's a lot of great people here, and of course my family is here because I grew up in this area. So thank you again for having me. So obviously the title of my talk is a little bit of a riff on the supposed Benjamin Franklin quote of, after they worked out the American independence of what do we have, he said, a republic if you can keep it. And I think right now we're having the questions about whether we're keeping our republic. So I thought it would be worth riffing on this concept to say, how is it that we can get nuclear deals, but we don't seem to be able to keep them? So I'll try to do a little bit of background on my experience working on both North Korea and Iran, and try to draw some lessons learned from both of these cases. And I'm going to hope that this clicker machine works well, and we'll see here. Aha, very good. So this is just a very quick overview of what I plan to talk about. I think it's worth sort of level setting what we know about both North Korea and Iran's nuclear programs, because they actually are different. They're often looped together in sort of the same sentence, but they're not actually the same. And then I'll go a little bit into history about a previous deal with North Korea that we did have in place for a while as part of the six-party talks. And then talk a little bit how the experience of the six-party talks informed the negotiators for the Iran nuclear deal, and in many ways improved upon the work that was done on North Korea, but then talk a little bit about why, even in that case, we haven't been successful in maintaining a nuclear deal that survives. And then I will try to close with some suggestions about how to try to do this better in the future, but acknowledging that it's always a very difficult one, a difficult challenge. So I think it's worth thinking about, first of all, what does North Korea have? North Korea has an extensive nuclear program. It's been working on nuclear issues for decades, going back to the 80s and before, primarily with cooperation from the Soviet Union. But also a lot of people forget that the Yongbyon reactor, which is the reactor that ultimately produced the plutonium used in North Korea's first nuclear weapons, was based upon a British design. This was in the era of atoms for peace, the Eisenhower era concept that nuclear energy can only do good things for the world. And our British friends published designs for their Calder Hall reactor, which made it easy for other countries to try to duplicate them if you had enough knowledge and wherewithal. And because of the cooperation with the Soviets, we can actually thank the Brits in a way for North Korea's plutonium. They also have a uranium enrichment facility, and it's worth remembering for a crowd that may not be ensconced in the language of nuclear that there are sort of two pathways to a nuclear weapon. One is plutonium, and the other is highly enriched uranium. Remember that in nature, uranium, the uranium isotope that you need is not found in nature. You have to basically enrich it through a process of either spinning centrifuges or using other procedures to get enough of that isotope that can lead to the fissile reaction that would lead to either a nuclear weapon or a nuclear reaction in a reactor. So North Korea has both of these pathways, and they also have tested nuclear weapons. They have a test site, and they have likely other facilities that we don't know about. These are only the facilities that some of us have been to. And as you'll see later, I've had the, I guess you could say, pleasure of visiting Yongbyon and seeing some of these facilities firsthand. They have a lot of uranium, which is why they've been able to do this work. And perhaps more importantly is they also have potentially a method to deliver these nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not really worth much if you can't get them anywhere to your desired target. And of course, the North Koreans have been working for decades on delivery systems, mainly on missiles. And we know that North Korea has a range of ballistic missile capabilities, including potentially the ability to deliver an intercontinental range missile to the United States. One of the important things to note here is that they have never tested a vehicle that has actually re-entered the atmosphere. So the question is, they may be able to launch something, but if it cannot survive the re-entry, is it actually a credible deterrent, a credible weapon? So North Korea's program is really big, but the really important point is this. North Korea has nuclear weapons. We don't know how many exactly. It depends upon who you talk to, and those of us who have or continue to work in the US government, and there are a few of us here in the audience today, more than I expected, would tell you that we don't know exactly how many, but we know that we have them. And it depends upon which intelligence agency you talk to and which calculation, which assumptions you make. So the current public range that you see is between 30 and 60. Dr. Stig Hecker, who is the former head of Los Alamos National Laboratory, a well-respected expert who's been to North Korea many times, I think his last estimate, if you had to try to pin him down, was somewhere around 38. But needless to say, they have more than a few. So how does this differ from Iran? Well, Iran has a civil nuclear program. Iran has also had a nuclear program for many decades. One of the things that a lot of people forget is that Iran's nuclear program came from the United States. And this was in the era of the Shah, and their their first reactor was actually a US reactor. It's still in operation in Tehran, and it ran on high enriched uranium. So those of us that wonder, how did the Iranians get into this business? Well, you can thank us. In addition to civil nuclear power, which they do have at least one reactor developed and operating at a place called Bushehr, based upon a Russian design, they also have developed the capabilities to enrich uranium. And again, this is a dual-use capability that can be used both to make fuel for a weapon or fuel for a reactor. In this case, the enrichment capabilities came from the same place in many ways that we think the North Koreans did, which was the network of the former Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan. And so this is a reminder that proliferation in the world is dangerous, and if it had not been for Mr. Khan, Dr. Khan, it's possible that neither North Korea nor Iran would have an enrichment program, but they do. They had a heavy water research reactor that could have produced plutonium, but it never went into operation. So unlike North Korea, to date, Iran has not made any plutonium. And like North Korea, they are developing and have developed a pretty extensive ballistic missile program. In this case, with the help of North Korea, who have sold the Iranians quite a few designs and actual missile parts. They have probably not gotten as far as the North Koreans have. And in fact, we just had recently an announcement that the Iranians attempted to launch a satellite into orbit, but it did not succeed. And whenever you see a space launch vehicle launch, you get nervous because there are similar technologies involved in launching a satellite that could be used in an ICBM. But here's the really important difference. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. They had plans to develop nuclear weapons, and we know this from information that has been declassified by the US intelligence community, by national intelligence estimates put out by the US, and also by the work done by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But we have seen no evidence that these plans made it past the year 2003, which you might note is the same year of the Iraq War. So since that time, the US policy has been to try to prevent Iran from resuscitating this program and having the ability, or potentially the latent capability, to have a nuclear weapons program. So let's start and look at a process that in North Korea that was an attempt to take a step back from where North Korea was at the time, which in 2005 and 2006, where North Korea had developed a nuclear weapons program and had actually tested, by 2006, a nuclear weapon. The six-party talks were a response to the fact that the Bush administration had left an earlier deal on North Korea, something called the Agreed Framework, which was negotiated during the Clinton administration, in large part started with the prompting of the visit of Jimmy Carter to North Korea back in 1992, 1993, when it became initially clear that North Korea may have been working towards a nuclear weapon and may have started to reprocess plutonium. The Bush administration, when they came in 2000, decided that they wanted to leave the Agreed Framework. They did not like the deal. There's a factor here that is very consistent, and to this day, that of the name of John Bolton. And Ambassador Bolton and others who were involved in advising the Bush administration recommended that it leave the Agreed Framework. And the reason for this is basically that there was evidence that North Korea was cheating on the deal, that they were trying to develop a uranium enrichment capability to augment the plutonium capability that had been frozen under the old deal. That was actually true, to give credit to Ambassador Bolton. But there's a lot of questions about whether it made sense to leave that deal and then let North Korea basically expand its program unconstrained rather than try to correct the cheating. So by 2004, 2005, we're in the second term of the Bush administration, and it becomes clear that North Korea is not going to stop developing its nuclear capabilities, and we've lost the agreed framework, so what are we going to do instead? So the concept was that the six parties relevant to the region, the United States, China, Russia, Japan, North and South Korea, would get together and negotiate a multilateral deal. And in that deal, there was an agreement in September of 2005 that led to a joint statement saying that North Korea would verifiably denuclearize in a peaceful manner, abandon all of its nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs, and return to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and to the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency. If you've been paying attention to the news lately, this sounds kind of similar to some of the things that you're hearing about from the Trump administration. And in exchange, the United States would provide certain types of energy assistance and would potentially help build North Korea a civil nuclear program and lead towards the development of a peace treaty, a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and the restoration of, or actually the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and North Korea. This was accomplished through not only the initial September 19th joint statement, but then a series of small deals from there to try to, in a step-by-step manner, bring North Korea back from the brink and begin to take apart its nuclear program. We came up with a concept called disablement, which is not dismantlement. Dismantlement would be a more permanent measure. Disablement was intentionally a reversible step. And in exchange, we gave the North Koreans, the 6 parties gave the North Koreans energy assistance, namely that of heavy fuel oil. I took these photos at Yongbyon back in 2007, and you can see there the operations that were taking place. They were removing the fuel from the reactor, they were cutting pipes, they were taking out the insides of a cooling tower, which was eventually exploded. The problem is that we had a step-by-step approach that never got to the next step. If you ever look at transcripts from that era, our lead negotiator from that time, Ambassador Chris Hill, would talk about various phases. The first phase was shutting down and sealing North Korea's reactor and some of its facilities at Yongbyon. The second phase was this disablement that I showed. The third phase was supposed to be leading towards dismantlement and verification of what North Korea had done, including verifying how much nuclear material it had made. Well, phase 3 was a little bit like waiting for Godot. It never came. And there's reasons for that. In 2007, the revelations came out that North Korea had built a nuclear reactor for Syria on the same design as the Yongbyon reactor that our Israeli friends took out. We had continuing concerns about the covert activities on its enrichment program, and our Japanese friends in particular were concerned about the legacy of Japanese citizens who had been abducted from Japan and taken to North Korea, some of whom were never accounted for. And that's a picture of Megumi Yokota, who is probably the most famous, a young girl that was literally taken off of the beach in Japan and never to be seen again. So this is my first of 2 cameo appearances in this presentation. The effort that was made then, as the 6-party talks started to fall apart, was to move the phase 3 deal, which was the verification process, forward to phase 2. And there was an effort to try to come up with a verification regime. North Korea provided a declaration of its nuclear capabilities and nuclear facilities, which was incomplete. And it provided 18,000 pages of documents on the operations of the reactor and other facilities at Yongbyon. Most of the disablement steps got taken, but not all of them. And as the Bush administration decided to move the verification question forward into phase 2, North Korea began to complain. And it had already begun to slow down these steps, but it particularly balked at what we were asking them to do, which was to allow the IAEA or the United States to take samples in facilities and to declare its uranium enrichment program, which at the time it said did not exist. So now, somehow, we've gotten to this. And I've sort of skipped a lot of steps here, but what you can see is that we had an entire period from the mid-2000s through to 2009 when the North Koreans ultimately kicked us out and kicked out the IAEA inspectors, and then a period of almost a decade whereby North Korea's program developed completely on its own without any constraints. And then once again, we are here trying to reconstitute a nuclear deal. And we'll get to it a little bit later, but the Singapore statement that was issued after this meeting will look very similar and very familiar. In fact, it's actually less detailed than the September 19th joint statement. It makes no reference to verification. It doesn't talk about the sequence of events. It doesn't really provide any details at all for how to negotiate future steps. And the one big accomplishment that came out of Singapore, which was Kim Jong-un unilaterally declaring that he would no longer test nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, was not included in the document. And even when it was issued, there were already disputes as to what the document said and what it meant. North Korea particularly said that it wanted to take steps in an action-for-action manner, in a step-by-step manner. The United States said that was not what we agreed. We, in fact, want to do things much faster. And there was very different views on how to reward or compensate the North Koreans for the steps that they were taking. North Korea wants sanctions relief, sanctions that were in place by the United Nations and by the United States. But the United States position so far has been there will be no sanctions relief until complete denuclearization. So in other words, do everything first, get rid of all your nuclear weapons, and then we promise at the end we'll relieve sanctions and let your economy develop. And then the other thing that the Trump administration did was that President Trump came out at the end of the meeting and to the surprise of even our South Korean allies said that he was going to suspend US-South Korea military exercises, which was something that the North Koreans particularly disliked, but so did our Chinese colleagues. And again, none of this was actually included in the document. So you can see that, we on the Korea desk used to say that the sequel is not as good as the original. It's kind of like, one of these action movies. You never want to watch part 3, you only want to watch part 1, because it just continues to go down this pathway of repeating the same cycle and the same sequence without getting any new result. So you contrast this to the Iran deal. And if you actually were to print out the agreed framework or the text of the September 19th joint statement from North Korea, and then print out the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, well, first of all, I hope you have a lot of paper in the printer because the JCPOA is about 150 pages long. The agreed framework, I think, is 2 or 3 pages. And I believe the September 19th joint statement is maybe 4. So details matter. And that was one of the things that our negotiators on the Iran deal learned from the North Korea experience, is that leaving things to interpretation and leaving things until later phases may not be the best way to go, because if you want to keep a deal going, you actually have to know a little bit more about where you're going. And so, yes, we took a phased approach in the JCPOA, but we started at the beginning, at the outset, with verification from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we provided a very defined, limited set of quids for quos. So there was an initial freeze deal called the Joint Plan of Action, in which sanctions relief was provided in a limited way. But then it was meant to build time to build the more comprehensive deal. These things take a lot of time. I think if you look at the amount of time it took, it was over 1.5 years between the freeze deal, the JPOA, and the actual full Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action coming into place. We took that time because we wanted to get it right. We also took that time because we wanted to make sure that Iran wasn't going to continue to develop its program in the meantime. So getting the freeze first and keeping it from getting even more nuclear material was key to this. So the JCPOA did a better job of balancing what Iran would get versus what the United States would get. The JCPOA provided sanctions relief for Iran, but not complete sanctions relief. It provided sanctions relief for those sanctions that were put in place that were meant to pressure Iran to stop its nuclear program. And so we actually had to go through and negotiate what that meant by nuclear sanctions. What did it mean to lift nuclear sanctions? And we actually sat there and literally went through lists of people's names and companies and said, this sanctions relief will occur for this person, but not for that person. We also incorporated something called a snapback mechanism. The idea behind this was that if Iran were to violate its commitments, there was a concern that the international community, particularly Russia and China, wouldn't want to put sanctions back on Iran because sanctions are not very popular with the Russians and the Chinese. But we didn't want to lose that pressure, that sort of sword of Damocles over the Iranians' head to say, don't mess up, don't screw this up, otherwise sanctions will be put back in place. So we came up, I shouldn't say we, our negotiators came up with an innovative strategy that would allow, without allowing for the veto of the Russians or the Chinese, for the UN to reimpose sanctions on Iran if they were not upholding their commitments under the nuclear deal. But in the meantime, we kept all of the major US national sanctions in Iran in place. As I said, details matter. We started, and we didn't try to reinvent the wheel here. We started with an internationally accepted verification regime led by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But then we added upon that we added specific elements to deal with weaponization, specific elements that we knew based upon intelligence that had been collected of what Iran had been up to, and to prevent them from being able to conduct these activities in the future, and to allow inspectors to take a look at these things if they had evidence that it was underway. We also allowed for the use of advanced technology. This device at the top of the screen here is something called an OLEM, the Online Enrichment Monitor, which actually monitors in real time the enrichment level of uranium coming through the pipes in the facilities in Iran to know whether or not they are staying within the limitations that were spelled out in the deal. There are very specific numeric numbers, numeric values in the deal that have to be respected, like no more than 3.67% enrichment, no more than 300 kilograms of enriched uranium, no more than 5,060 centrifuges at Natanz, not 5,000, not 5,100, 5,060. And the reason for this is because at the end of the day, our goal in the Iran deal was to prevent Iran from having enough nuclear material to make one bomb. And we wanted to have enough time to be able to respond if it did so. When we started negotiating the JCPOA, that so-called breakout timeline was anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks. That's not a lot of time for the international community to respond if a decision is made to race to a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA, after it was all calculated by our nuclear engineers and physicists in the intelligence community and in the US national labs, brought that breakout timeline up to 1 year, giving the international community much more time to respond if the Iranians were cheating. A lot of times people ask me, well, aren't the Iranians going to cheat? The answer is, we assume that they might cheat. But the key here is to be able to have time to respond and to have the verification measures in place to give us the heads up if that's going to happen. This is a picture of the before and after of the Arak heavy water reactor. The thing in the middle there is called the calandria. It's basically the core of the reactor. And as part of the JCPOA, Iran removed that and filled it in with concrete, and it was observed by the IAEA, and it was left with a hole in the ground, basically. This reactor could have produced plutonium that could have been used in a nuclear weapon. The Israelis were particularly concerned about this, and it's a great accomplishment that's often overlooked, and it still is like this to this day, basically an unusable reactor. One of the ways we had success in the JCPOA is we got partners to buy in. We got the Chinese to agree to help us work on the conversion of this reactor. We got the Russians to agree to take over 12,000 pounds of enriched uranium out of the country and move it to Russia. And we got the Europeans to agree to help Iran improve its safety culture, upgrade its nuclear security, and allow for other areas for research that would redirect Iran's nuclear workers from potential military operations to civilian ones that could be monitored by the international community. And I think the other thing that's really important to know is early on, the Obama administration determined what they could get and what they could not get in this deal. And there's been lots of critiques about, well, this deal didn't cover their missile program. This deal didn't cover their terrorist acts in the region. But there was a determination that these things were all concerns we had about Iran. But in Iran that had missiles, in Iran that had proxies in the region, in Iran that threatened our ships in the Gulf, was an even more dangerous Iran if it had a nuclear weapon. And so you had to get the thing off the table that was most dangerous, which was the nuclear weapon. And so to use some negotiating terminology, we had to know our ZOPA, our zone of possible agreements. And ultimately, we determined that getting missiles included wasn't going to work, and trying to prevent them from having any enrichment at all was not going to work. One of the other things that we learned about the North Korea case was that you can't just stop at getting a deal. You actually have to work at implementing the deal. And in the Iran case, we had a dedicated implementation team at the State Department run by initially a career ambassador. We have a member of that team hiding in the audience here. I won't call her out, but she was also involved. And this is the office that ultimately I ended up kind of running in the absence of anybody else when the Trump administration came into place. You can't do these sort of deals on oversight without a dedicated team. We also had, in addition to a State Department national team to run implementation, we had an oversight body that was created by the JCPOA that was multinational, all of the parties to the deal. There's something called the Joint Commission. And this is my second cameo appearance in the presentation. But that is a picture of one of the last meetings of the Joint Commission that involved the United States. And this was a body that meets every quarter to oversee and evaluate the implementation of the deal and work out areas where we have concerns. And I can tell you that there are a lot of disputes that took place that never made their light in the media, but that we use this body to help resolve. And we didn't have this in the agreed framework, and we didn't have this in the six-party talks. Anybody that tells you that verification is always going to be 100% possible is lying to you. Verification is a bit of an art as well as a science, and the only way to know for sure that 100% that you don't have any nuclear activities happening in the country is to invade that country and occupy it and go to every site in the locations in the country. So verification is really a question of how much are you willing to determine that you have enough information and enough insight that you don't believe that there are military activities taking place. We believe that the JCPOA gave us much more insight into what was going on in their program than any other verification regime that exists today. And in the meantime, you use an iterative process. So the value of, for example, the access provisions in the JCPOA that allow the IAEA to ask to go to locations that have not been declared in a very short period of time, less than 1 month if needed, and sometimes much shorter than that, allows you to use an iterative process to essentially investigate whether or not Iran is complying. I always sort of think about the IAEA a little bit like CSI or a Law and Order episode. They get a trace of something and they go, huh, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from. Could I go look in that room over there? Okay, let me look in that. Well, now I got to look next door. Now I got to look across the street. That's what the IAEA does, and they're an independent UN body that is not being controlled by any particular nation. Sometimes to the frustration of the United States, and sometimes to the frustration of other countries. And I just included this line here that my boss, Secretary Moniz, likes to say. In the case of the Soviet Union, you used to hear President Reagan say about arms control, trust but verify. In the case of Iran, Secretary Moniz likes to say, don't trust, but verify, verify, verify. Anybody that believes that we came up with the JCPOA on the basis of trusting the Iranians is fooling themselves. If you read the document, and people like Secretary Mattis have said this publicly, you can see that the document was designed on the assumption that Iran was not to be trusted. But some things didn't work, and we can see that it didn't work because the JCPOA is not really where it needs to be today. Unlike the six-party talks, we didn't have the regional players as directly involved. Congress was not a big fan of the Iran nuclear deal, not just the Republicans, but also the Democrats. And there were opportunities, I should say, there were instances where sometimes the JCPOA was seen and sold as the savior for all of our problems in the Middle East. When in fact it was really targeted at one specific issue, which was Iran having or not having a nuclear weapon. And so as we were coming to the end of the Obama administration, there was some frustration about maybe we should be doing more on things like Iran's missile program, Iran's regional activities, and its interference in naval traffic in the Gulf. So obviously on May 8th, 2018, the Trump administration decided to leave the JCPOA, claiming that it didn't cover enough issues, didn't cover enough of Iran's malign activities, and that elements of it expired after time, which made it not worth keeping. We left the deal on May 8th, 2018. I left the State Department on May 10th, 2018, and you can make whatever conclusions there you'd like. But it's worth taking a look and see what has happened since we left the deal. The United States has reimposed all of the sanctions on Iran and then some under a campaign of so-called maximum pressure, including bans on oil purchases, banking transactions, additional sanctions measures against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, pressured the Europeans to increase pressure as well. The Europeans are still in this deal, along with Russia and China. And then, of course, most recently, we've had an uptick in tensions in the region from drone attacks, the mines placed in the Gulf that negatively impacted shipping and actually damaged several tankers. Then the attack on our embassy in Baghdad that many believe was directed, some believe was directed by Iranian proxies, and then ultimately the US attack that killed the IRGC leader, Qasem Soleimani. The result on that side is an Iranian economy that has gone down, GDP growth dropped by 3.8%, and a region on the verge of war at least twice. In the meantime, Iran has said it will have maximum resistance. And so after 1 year of the Iranians basically standing pat and implementing the nuclear deal, even though the United States had reimposed sanctions, it started to walk away from that deal. And it started exceeding various limits in the deal, including on the amount of enriched uranium it could have, the level of enrichment, the amount of heavy water it could have, which is a material used in plutonium production reactors. It restarted enrichment at an underground facility called Fordo, which is very hard to bomb, and has started installing advanced centrifuges in larger and larger numbers, all of which are far before the time by which the original nuclear deal envisioned that this would take place. Ironically enough, the Trump administration said that the original Iran nuclear deal was a bad one because it would allow Iran to undertake these activities at some point in the future. But by leaving the nuclear deal, they're undertaking these activities today. And right after, in a sort of a coincidental way, it was actually timed and expected before the Soleimani attack, the Iranians announced their fifth and final step, as they call it, which was basically to say that they no longer feel that they have any restrictions on uranium enrichment. Though they have not actually taken any new actions in this regard, they've just said that they no longer feel constrained. But they have not kicked out the international inspectors. And this is a really key point, that we still have insight as to what Iran is up to. And we have a good sense that if they were to race to a nuclear weapon, that the inspectors would be able to see this coming. But the bottom line is this, that breakout timeline that I talked about is now definitely less than 1 year. There's lots of different disputes about how much shorter it is. But as Iran continues to undertake these activities, that breakout timeline will shorten. So a couple of lessons learned. First of all, denuclearization or other processes related to arms control don't happen quickly. They require details, and they require the involvement of technical people. Our negotiators, both for North Korea and Iran, involved a lot of people from the Department of Energy and our nuclear labs and the intelligence community. And we used to take advantage, the negotiators used to take advantage of the time difference between Vienna, where the negotiations took place for the Iran deal, and the United States, whereby if we had a new proposal that came forward during the talks, they would then send that information back to our experts at the labs and say, while we're asleep, please run the numbers and tell us whether or not this gets us what we want. So you need the technical involvement. In the case of North Korea, and frankly in Iran as well, you can't just do this in a vacuum. You have to take into account the security requirements of the regional players. And in the case of North Korea, we have at NTI argued that getting a nuclear deal and learning the lessons from these previous experiences requires a cooperative approach to denuclearization. As we would say, you're not going to have denuclearization be done to North Korea, it needs to be done with North Korea. And we've issued a report last year in June. My colleague Lynn Rustin and I wrote a report that suggests, building on the experience of the former Soviet Union, when Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar helped put forward legislation that allowed for what's called a cooperative threat reduction approach to nuclear programs and to other WMD programs. This is the concept that the use of cooperative, first of all, the provision of funds, but also the provision of equipment, the provision of personnel, the provision of technology, can help to cooperatively convert facilities in locations from military purposes to civilian purposes. In the case of the Soviet Union, this actually helped to repatriate nuclear warheads from the former Soviet states when they broke off back into Russian territory. This program was done to help to shut down various nuclear facilities, chemical weapons production facilities. And we think in the case of North Korea, it could be done in a way that could convert existing North Korean nuclear programs either to civil purposes under the very strict monitoring of the IAEA, or towards dismantlement purposes, but involving North Korean personnel such that they have a job, they have no reason to try to find a job somewhere else or for somewhere else, and to potentially to convert them into other fields, North Korea will have a lot of work to do in environmental remediation. The health effects of all of this nuclear activity are probably quite profound, particularly in Yongbyon. We actually recommend even building a medical center there to look at cancer and other potential knockoff effects of all this work. And the safety culture in North Korea is almost non-existent. So there's a lot of opportunities for training on safety and security. And the other thing that you could do is start to involve North Korean scientists and engineers in peaceful general science activities with their counterparts in the rest of the world. This is a program, again, that was undertaken with the former Soviet Union, but also other states that, again, sort of redirected these scientists away from military programs, gave them an incentive to maybe travel, but to do work that is not proliferation sensitive. And we think that this is something that could be enhanced by the involvement not just of the United States, of whose taxpayers may not want to spend a lot of money on North Korea for, but also to get the involvement of Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan, but also countries outside the region, either through raising funds or providing technology or expertise. A lot of these countries have a lot of experience converting nuclear reactors to civilian purposes, and particularly, for example, in Japan, lessons learned from the Fukushima incident that could allow for improvement in training and safety. So lastly, I want to leave time for a little bit of questions. I think a couple of lessons learned here. First things first, you have to always put verification at the center of these deals. Waiting to do verification in the case of the six-party talks was a mistake. And even if you can't get complete declarations and a complete and comprehensive verification deal at the outset, you need to at least start somewhere and use iterative processes to learn more and more about the program in question, ultimately leading to a complete and correct understanding of the program that you are trying to address. We should not be put off by the fact that the North Koreans, for example, might give us an incorrect and incomplete declaration. Just because that happens should not mean that media headlines should scream, they're cheating and this should be the end of the deal. No, we should expect this and use that as the beginning of a process. We have to understand what we mean when we use the words that we put into the negotiating text. And because diplomacy often allows for some gray areas, you have to be as detailed as you possibly can get, using our technical expertise to the extent that we can. And then when we do have parts of these agreements that are unclear, we need to have some way to resolve these questions in the future. Some sort of dispute mechanism, dispute resolution mechanism, or other oversight body to be able to not allow these agreements to sort of spiral out of control, but to try to keep them in place as long as we possibly can. This is not going to happen quickly, and particularly in the case of North Korea. In the case of Iran, one of the reasons that there was such a priority in getting a deal so soon was that we knew that it was always going to be harder to get rid of nuclear weapons than to prevent nuclear weapons from being developed in the first place. And so in a country like North Korea that has 30 plus nuclear warheads, you're not going to be able to just put them all on a plane and send them to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's not going to happen. I don't care what John Bolton says. You're going to have to be able to build in lots of time, potentially decades, before you get to a complete denuclearization. And even then, it may not be possible. But there would be benefit to getting a freeze on nuclear material production to cap these programs. A North Korea that has 38 nuclear weapons is a lot different than a North Korea that has 300 nuclear weapons. And it changes their calculus and it changes the viewpoint that they would take in terms of what they would do in the region and how they would potentially threaten South Korea, Japan, and our regional neighbors. Again, you have to have realistic timeframes and do things early on that can build some trust and confidence, which is again why I think it's important to think about things like freezes and reductions in stockpiles. The weapons are going to come much later. And I think you need to do a better job than we did in the JCPOA case in building allies for the deal. Not just allies in the sense of different countries, but allies in Congress and allies in the public space. And I think these details, these agreements are so complex, it's a little bit hard. I've been talking about this for almost an hour. It's a little bit hard to put this into a soundbite or a tweet, but we need to find a way to sort of build in more public trust in these kinds of nuclear deals. And then finally, I think this is my final one, we need to be willing to give to get things. And the current administration's approach, for example, of no sanctions relief before complete denuclearization, to me is a complete non-starter. That doesn't mean we should give away the store to North Korea. And the deal that was on the table in Hanoi was a bad deal, and the president was right to turn it down. But what we need to worry about is if we can't get more for more, maybe we can try to get less for less. And if that means starting with a freeze of fissile material production at Yongbyon, that could be coupled with very limited sanctions relief, potentially time limited, not in a large amount of economic benefit, but things that could at least be face-saving for the North Koreans. And if you incorporate the snapback procedure that we talked about in the Iran deal, it could give you the ability to reimpose those sanctions if the North Koreans cheat. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think it's a mistake to think that we can impose this on any country. The work that has to be done to convert these programs and move towards a purely civilian situation will require cooperation, and the North Koreans are going to have to do this work themselves. We're not going to be able to send in armies of Americans and others to do this work. It's their nuclear weapons, it's their designs, it's their facilities. I dare you to send a lot of these people who are going to want to touch a North Korean nuclear warhead and say, you take this apart. It's the North Koreans who should take them apart, but with some supervision and with some oversight. And so we're going to have a cooperative approach that allows for both sides to feel like that they've gotten something out of this process. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. And thanks again for having me. This has really been a thrill to be back here at CMC.
We now have some time for questions. Please raise your hand, and Sophia and I will come to you with the microphone. As always, priority will go to students, and when asking your question, please stand up and try to keep them brief.
Thank you so much for your talk. I found that very, very informative, and I imagine everybody else did as well. Quick question. So what worries you the most looking at the next few decades? What keeps you up at night?
Interestingly enough, it's actually not these two cases. The thing that worries me the most is the fact that the structures of arms control between the United States and Russia are falling apart before our very eyes. And we have already lost one treaty in the last year. That is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of the INF. And if the Trump administration doesn't act in the next year, we will lose the only remaining arms control treaty left between the US and Russia, and that's the New START treaty that are keeping US and Russian nuclear warheads down to a set level of 1,500 deployed on each side. So this entire effort that has been going on for decades between the US and the Soviets and then the Russians is starting to sort of fall apart. And so I worry about the degradation in arms control. I worry about, and here I'm literally tweeting or retweeting, if you will, in person, the talking points of our organization. But we are very concerned about the potential for not a planned, Cold War style nuclear war or exchange, but a blunder or an accident leading to nuclear war. And if you look at new technologies, for example, in the cyber realm or in the AI realm, it sounds like a movie, but what if somebody were to hack into our command and control systems and make it look like there was an incoming nuclear attack from Russia? It doesn't take there's not a lot of time that's available to the president, who, by the way, has the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons, to decide whether or not to launch nuclear weapons and get them out of their silos before the Russians land and potentially destroy those weapons. So, do you really want that situation right now? It's concerning that we don't have the level of dialogue between the United States and Russia, even taking into account all of the negative things that Russia has done in interfering in our elections and Ukraine and other things. But even in the darkest days of the Cold War, we had this level of interaction with the Russians, and that's starting to fall apart. So that's the thing that keeps me up at night more than anything else. These are sadly secondary.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. Along the same thread of thought, it has recently been reported that Russia is now developing low-yield nuclear weapons. And the US, in response to that, has also started to plan for developing low-yield nuclear weapons. And low-yield nuclear weapons are basically weapons that have a smaller capacity to either by radius or by tonnage, essentially. Considering that this is now, some are saying a new arms race, how do you see the theory of deterrence being shifted when the deterrent itself is so small?
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's a really great question. And I will put the caveat for it. I just told a bunch of students today, I said, one of the good lessons learned I've had over the last years is don't talk about stuff that you don't know really well. So I'm gonna talk about this a little bit, but I am not, I'm less of a Russia sort of nuclear posture person than I am on these other issues. And knowing that my office will be watching this video, I want to make sure I get it right. But I think I can say, at least to answer your question, is this is what I was just sort of talking about. The concern that low-yield nuclear weapons have been part of both the Russian and the U.S. stockpiles for many years. We have low-yield weapons now. But you're right that there is a growing, and I would sort of generalize this to say there's a growing sense that both on the U.S. and the Russian side, there's a movement to kind of modernize the arsenals and potentially come up with new capabilities, whether that's on delivery systems like hypersonic missiles or hypersonic delivery systems, or different kinds of new warheads. And so the issue on deterrence is just to say that when we were in the Cold War environment, when you're talking about sort of mutually assured destruction, I think it was a little bit easier for the theorists to game out how this would work. And you're talking about two great powers who would think this through and decide when you would use weapons and when you would not. And it would be sort of an intentional thing. When you start to add in all these other new factors, like how would you respond to a low yield attack? And can you tell that a missile that's being launched has a low yield warhead on the end of it as opposed to a much more strategic weapon? And so what would you launch in response? What if the Russians launched something low yield, but the US then launched a much more powerful weapon? You're still getting into nuclear war there in a pretty horrible way. And again, what about the fact that this might be a one-off situation? It's not going to be a huge number of weapons being launched all at the same time. This doesn't necessarily fall into that playbook of deterrence. So without getting into too much detail, I would say that I think that there's a big discussion and debate going on right now in the nuclear nonproliferation and arms control space as to whether that theory of nuclear deterrence really holds up in the current state of global affairs, where you have different actors playing a role, different kinds of systems, and potentially different decision calculuses. And so there's a lot of people that are looking at maybe we need a new approach to this that doesn't follow that deterrence theory. And I'm now at the limit of my knowledge, and so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for your speech. So while Obama was campaigning, I believe he said he'd be open to meeting with North Koreans, and when Trump actually did, as we all saw. And both times there was some backlash about them so-called legitimizing the regime. So in your opinion, at what point in a country's nuclearization process is it appropriate for the US to go and meet with them in hopes of beginning denuclearization, if bilateral negotiations are at all appropriate?
So I think, so two comments. As a diplomat, I am always for talks in the absence of something else. And so, yeah, there's a lot of debate. And to be honest, I was quite surprised and a little bit concerned initially at the decision for President Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un. Not so much because of the concept of the meeting itself. And in fact, as you said, in previous administrations, others had considered a leader-level discussion because their system essentially is a top-down driven system. And so if you want to accomplish something, you're going to have to get the blessing from the center. Bill Clinton was working hard to get a missile deal at the end of his term, but the story goes that the only way that they were going to see if that could be achieved or not would be if the US promised to send President Clinton to Pyongyang before he left office. And because of the Gore-Bush recount and many other factors, and just frankly the fact that we didn't have a guarantee in advance that this deal had been completed, the Clinton administration decided not to send Bill Clinton. Madeleine Albright had gone in advance. But there was concern about going and trying to meet with this leader and then coming away with nothing. So our organization was actually not super negative on the Kim-Trump visit in concept. My concern is that there was no groundwork laid in advance for what the outcome of that summit was going to be. And as we saw, and as I mentioned somewhat in my slides, the statement that came out was very minimal. And in fact, the major accomplishments or the major changes in policy were basically things that were announced unilaterally either before or after the meeting, either by the North Koreans or by the United States. And when you got to the next summit in Hanoi, there was some effort to try to do this laying of groundwork, but the North Koreans basically didn't want to engage on anything nuclear related. They talked about other things, but not so much on nuclear. And so that shows you the risk of doing this leader level engagement, which is that now, I think of it a little bit like, when you're a little kid and you go to one parent and say, hey mom, can I go outside? And mom says, no, you can't go outside. And then you run and see, hey dad, can I go outside? You go to find the person who will give you the answer that you want to get. And in the case of North Korea, when they weren't getting the answers that they wanted from our working level negotiators, our diplomats, they said, well, we'll just elevate this to Donald Trump. He's the leader. He can make the decision. And in Hanoi, that didn't work out for the North Koreans. They actually didn't get the deal that they hoped to get, which was probably a big loss of face for Kim Jong-un and has raised a lot of concerns about whether or not Kim will be willing to come back to the table in the future. So that's a bit of a rambling answer to say that I'm almost always for the concept of a leader level meeting if that leader level meeting can accomplish a substantive outcome. And at this point, perhaps the best that we could do is if they were going to have any more engagements to say, we are now authorizing our envoys to do the really hard negotiating work of coming up with those detailed texts that you will need to get a deal. Because without those, you can have as many of those meetings as you want, but other than some tea and coffee exchange, nothing's going to happen.
Thank you for your talk. So I know you were relying a lot on the IAI. Like you said, well, they could have some issues, but essentially you could trust them for a lot of things. But I know, like, especially after Israel stole Iran's nuclear archives, like essentially a lot of the stuff they were saying about verification was wrong. We knew that they had a nuclear warehouse in Tehran, for example, where they were storing a lot of stuff that they weren't supposed to have. And we knew that that what IAI was saying about the level of advancement for their nuclear program was completely off. Like, they started at earlier dates and they had different equipment. And second, from more of like a broader perspective, if you're looking at this from only a nuclear angle, I mean, there are other sides. Like a lot of people believe, I guess, that Iran is ideologically opposed to the U.S. and our allies in the region. If we give them money through the elimination of sanctions, like it's probably undoubtable that a lot of what they would use that money for would be to threaten our interests through conventional means. I mean, Hezbollah has 400,000 rockets 30 miles away from our biggest ally in the region now. It's probably very likely that they use a lot of the money from the elimination of sanctions to give them hundreds of thousands of rockets.
Sure, really good questions. So first of all, on the so-called Israeli archive, I have not seen the archive myself in toto, though I've seen some of the things that have been released, and there's been some good reporting done on this. The striking thing about this is that nothing in the Israeli archive indicates anything different than what the U.S. intelligence community determined, including all the way back to 2005, or that the IAEA determined as part of its so-called possible military dimensions investigation, including its final sort of roadmap report at the end of 2015, right as the JCPOA was about to come into effect. And that is this, that Iran definitely had a structured nuclear weapons development program up until 2003, with some elements of that program potentially continuing on until about 2009. Now, you're correct that the Israeli archive apparently indicates that there's a lot more detail available now, because they stole these documents out of Iran, about some of the things that they were planning, and maybe in some areas they were a little bit more had gone along the path than in others. But essentially, there is no information about any activity occurring after those time frames. If you look at the JCPOA and how it was negotiated, it's not a coincidence that the so-called Section T on weaponization has very specific types of activities that are covered that are subject to verification and are explicitly prohibited under the deal. Things like multi-point detonation systems, things like nuclear weapon testing computer modeling. These are exactly the technologies that we were concerned that they were developing, and that is reflected also in the archive. So I guess I would take a little bit of an issue with your view that, that the deal did not account for those things, or that the deal didn't cover those things, because in fact it did. And in fact, the IAEA has said that it's implementing all elements of the nuclear deal, including the monitoring of Section T, the weaponization. And that's why I think it's important that having the nuclear deal in place is better than not having the nuclear deal in place, because it draws attention to exactly those activities. And as I said, no deal is going to 100% get you to the place where you know with 100% confidence that you have accounted for all nuclear activities in a country. But the fact that the information that was gleaned from those Israeli documents very much matched what was the information used to feed into the negotiations, to me gives me a pretty good sense that we had a pretty decent idea about what Iran was up to. Maybe we had the Reader's Digest version instead of the Dickensian version, but we had a pretty good idea about what they were up to. On the funding issue, so the sanctions relief that took place under the JCPOA, oftentimes you hear our president say that we gave Iran $150 billion as though we cut a check from the US Treasury or something. That is not what we did. What the United States did was it said that certain economic sanctions related to banking and transactions, and particularly related to Iranian accounts through in European and other banking institutions, could now be unfrozen, essentially. So this is not US money. This is Iranian money that was frozen in accounts and in other investments, and basically got stuck somewhere as part of sanctions. And that was intentional, of course, because we didn't want them to be able to exchange these funds. The intelligence community and the Treasury Department came out and said basically that the amount of money that actually was ultimately released that was really accessible to Iran, because a lot of these things were caught up in payment of loan debt and in insurance and other things, was probably more like $50 billion, not $150 billion. There was a separate transaction that took place of about $1.3 billion that was unrelated to the nuclear deal, which was a settlement of a legal dispute related to promised military sales to the Shah's government that never were completed. The Iranians basically paid, the Shah's government basically paid for military equipment, and it was never delivered after the Islamic Revolution. And there was a legal dispute in international courts, and it was basically a settlement that was done. And that transaction had to take place in cash, ironically enough, because of the sanctions that had been put in place, didn't allow for transactions to take place through the banking system. So when you hear the president talk about pallets of cash, that's what that's about, and it's not about the nuclear deal actually at all. As to the question about how much of this money got back to Hezbollah, the IRGC, and other Iranian proxies, the intelligence community monitors this pretty closely, and at least publicly what they said, both during the Obama administration and I believe during the Trump administration as well, is that the vast majority of the released funds likely went to domestic infrastructure and social programs within Iran and to pay off debts. So the assertion that all this money went to go pay for the attacks that were made on our embassy in Baghdad or on our troops in the region so far hasn't been, at least publicly, justified by this administration. What we believe, and I'm not an IRGC expert, but what we believe is that the IRGC, of course, has its own accounts, and it's always going to have, it's a little bit like defense spending in the United States. It's really hard to cut funding for that program, and these Iranians are likely going to continue to spend money on that regardless of sanctions, and they were under the sanctions regime before the JCPOA, after the sanctions relief took place under the JCPOA, and after those sanctions were reinstated after we left the JCPOA. And so because these are asymmetric type of activities, it's a little bit hard to say that just because the JCPOA was in effect, that this actually emboldened and increased the abilities for the IRGC to undertake regional activities. This trend of them being more assertive in the region can be traced not necessarily to the JCPOA coming into effect, but actually if you look back, it goes, the trend line begins going back to the Iraq War, when their main regional enemy, Iraq, the Saddam Hussein's Iraq, was taken out of power, and a new government that was more friendly to Iran put into place. So this is obviously a debate that a lot of people are having on this stage right now, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, thank you for while you're answering the questions and the speech. I know you're a foreign policy expert working in the State Department, but I'm wondering, with your exposure to North Korea and your pictures with Iran, can you speak a little bit about the domestic situation of North Korea and Iran? You know, if there's been any pushback. In the States, we're saying that we kind of gave them a picture that they can go and promote as propaganda vis-a-vis North Korea. I'm not sure how that works in Iran, but can you speak about, you know, like, how the regime's doing in the domestic eyes, and what the future, 15 years of the regime, their strength looks like? Thank you.
Sure. So we know more about Iran's domestic situation than we do about North Korea's. One of the things I missed the most about working at the State Department was getting a daily email that was a summary of Iranian press headlines. And while I would certainly not say that they have a free press in Iran, they have a very vibrant press in Iran. And none of the headlines ever matched. Each newspaper had a very different angle. So they do have a robust political debate within Iran. It doesn't reflect as full of a spectrum of politics as it probably should. And there's a lot of debate about, when we refer to the main two factions, you often hear to the reference of, sort of hardliners or principalists and kind of moderates. Some people will take a question to that term. Are they really a moderate? It's sort of moderate in comparison to what? And then there's a more reformist group that is essentially being kept out of politics. But we have some insight as to what's going on, at least in Iran. And while, again, I'm not an Iran regional expert per se, what we're seeing lately is a return to hardliner politics. The JCPOA, in many ways, was accomplished. There were sort of two big things that happened that led, I think, to the JCPOA happening. One was a decision by the Obama administration that recognized that it was probably unrealistic to try to roll back Iran's nuclear enrichment program completely, because at the stage it had gotten to, the Iranians had basically pocketed it and said, we're not going to give it up. But you could at least put some restrictions on it. The other thing, which is a domestic reason, was the election of Hassan Rouhani, a more moderate candidate, to office. And so the fact of the matter is that the negotiation environment changed quite a bit when Ahmadinejad left power and Rouhani came in. That does not mean that the overall ideology of Iran has changed and that they have become somehow, a friendly power. It's just that for whatever reason in the domestic politics, the supreme leader, Khamenei, basically allowed Rouhani and Zarif to say, yeah, okay, give this a shot if you want to do this nuclear deal. But he did not authorize any discussions on any other elements of what Iran would see as important to its national security, whether that's its missile program, whether that's the IRGC or other activities in the region. And in fact, our negotiators never really had any interaction with those parts of the Iranian government, which probably were much more controlled by Khamenei than they were by Rouhani. And so what's happened now is that small window that gave a little bit of kind of space to that sort of more moderate faction is closing and has almost completely closed because of the failure of the United States to stay in the JCPOA and the inability of the Iranian government to get the benefits that it perceived it would get in terms of sanctions relief and trade and investment from particularly Europe in exchange for these nuclear steps. And so what's now happening, and we're going to have an election in Iran very soon of its majlis, of its parliament. And again, election is a term we can put in quotes because it's not a free and fair election. The Iranians basically pre-approve who can be the candidates. And in this case, the Iranians have disqualified even more candidates than in the past that could be seen as being in the moderate camp. And so we're going to get a very conservative and very hardline majlis. And that is a preview for their presidential elections that are going to happen next year. And it's very unlikely, Rouhani will not be running again, but it's very unlikely that you'll get a moderate president, quote, moderate president. So you're going to see, even if a Democrat is elected in 2020 and there's an effort to try to return to the JCPOA, you may have a mismatch in leadership, because at that point, the Iranians may have absolutely no interest in getting back into the deal. On North Korea, we have much less insight into their political situation, but it's clear that Kim Jong-un is, or at least was, trying to be a different kind of leader. We're not exactly sure why that is. Some people speculate that's because of his training, at a boarding school in Switzerland. What's more likely is that he is interested. What's more likely is that, first of all the things that I laid out on that screen about the developments in North Korea's nuclear program have given North Korea a little bit more confidence to say, aha, we have a deterrent now, so we no longer have to be working so hard just to focus on our nuclear program. We can try to also work on our economic development as well. And if we can do that with the United States, great, but if not, then we'll try and do it with the Chinese and others. And so it seems that the North Koreans at least wanted to sort of float this concept of trying to negotiate with us. But the failure of Hanoi, I think, has really been a real problem for Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un has domestic politics. We don't know as much about them, but he does still have to play to various audiences in Pyongyang, including the Korean People's Army and the party. The fact that after Hanoi, you basically didn't hear anything from the North Koreans for months indicated to a lot of people that they were sort of in a period of reflection and trying to figure out where they go from here. And if you look at the statement that that Kim Jong-un put out at their plenum session at the beginning of this year, it's pretty clear that they have basically said that we accept the fact that sanctions are going to be in place for a long time, and we're just going to have to muddle through and suffer with those. And so it appears that he felt kind of a little bit dissed by the outcome in Hanoi, and felt that he needed to sort of increase his own domestic credibility by sort of scaling back from this more engagement strategy. And it's one reason why, in fact, we probably see the North Koreans not being so willing to engage in negotiations since the failure of Hanoi and the follow-on Stockholm talks.
Tonight.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking with us. During the Obama administration, the New York Times Magazine did a long profile of Ben Rhodes that kind of throughout the piece made the argument that President Obama and Ben Rhodes were pursuing the strategy of signing an Iran deal as the first step in untying a kind of Gordian knot that ties the United States' interests to Israel's interests, and that with the Iran deal done, it could potentially put the United States on a path towards having less strong of a relationship with Israel, and that in turn could be the first step towards having a little bit of retrenchment from the Middle East as a whole. I'm wondering whether your primary source experience would tend to confirm that that was the goal of the Obama administration, or whether you experienced something different.
So I will stipulate that I was not that important to be able to be involved in any of those presumed conversations. I'm familiar with the piece that you're talking about. So this will be my personal perspective, and my personal perspective is that's a little bit overplayed. That argument is a little bit overplayed. The reality is that in the negotiations of the Iran nuclear deal, there was a lot of consultation and diplomatic effort going on in the background with Israel, and the fact that certain elements of the deal were ultimately incorporated, I think, were in fact because of the strong cooperation we had with our Israeli colleagues. The fact that we were able to get the Arak reactor taken apart, that was something that Israel was extremely concerned about. And even though it didn't make a lot of the headlines as compared to the uranium enrichment program, I know our Israeli colleagues were extremely relieved to see that reactor taken apart. So while Prime Minister Netanyahu may ultimately have been very unhappy with the deal, I can tell you in my interaction with Israeli national security officials and particularly their nuclear experts, while they may not say so on the record, they were actually fairly pleased with the JCPOA. Again, they weren't 100% pleased with it, and they probably had a lot of critiques about where it lacked a certain level of vigor that they hoped that it would have had. But they were certainly pleased that it was quite comprehensive. I can't say whether or not, the president was trying to, completely get ourselves out of the Middle East. I think it's clear that the politics of the United States, including up until today, have been focused in on this concern about endless wars and sort of entrenchment in the Middle East. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement to say that, the Iran nuclear deal was anything more than it was intended to be, which was a deal to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. I know some people have said in interviews, this was the first step. This will lead to a better relationship between Iran and the United States. These are things that obviously concerned, our Israeli allies. It concerned the Saudis, concerned the Emiratis. But if you listen to what President Obama actually said on the record, he would say, this is not about anything else but the nuclear deal. And I personally believe that if the JCPOA had stayed in place under a President Hillary Clinton, or frankly even under a President Donald Trump, that you could have used the fact that the nuclear issue was off the table for a while to try to see what else you could do with Iran to reduce tensions in the region, whether that's dealing with Yemen or whether that's dealing with the Gulf or other things, Afghanistan, for example. But I don't think anybody was so naive to believe that getting the Iran nuclear deal meant that ultimately there was not going to be any more involvement from Hezbollah or from the IRGC. And so, it's unfortunate that sometimes we see articles like this that I think overstate the case. I do think that the Obama administration had a strong priority to get a deal with Iran, and maybe the fact that that was such a strong priority, did concern colleagues in the region and allowed for these kinds of narratives to come about. But again, I can just tell you the amount of time and effort that was spent by my colleagues, and to a lesser extent by myself, in trying to coordinate with our Israeli colleagues and with others in the region, to me runs counter to that narrative. And I think that even in the future, if we were to get back into a sort of a JCPOA 2.0, there would be a very, very strong interest in involving the Israelis to the extent that we possibly could, because they're the ones that live in that region and not us, and they are our allies, and I don't think there's any interest in weakening that relationship.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for tonight. Please join me once again in thanking Richard Johnson.
Thank you.